When you really think about it, the spread of Islam across the world is one of the most fascinating stories in human history. We're not just talking about a religion that slowly trickled through cultures over centuries. We're talking about something that erupted in a small desert community and within just a few generations stretched across continents, reshaping entire civilizations. And what's wild is that when you look deeper, you realize it wasn't just about swords, battles, or conquest. It was about ideas, systems of living, and a way of viewing the world that made sense to millions of people. It all begins in 7th century Arabia. Imagine the Arabian Peninsula at that time. Fragmented tribes, constant wars, no centralized government, and a culture where loyalty to your clan or tribe was the only law that really mattered. The harsh desert shaped the people, tough, resilient, but also locked into this endless cycle of revenge and survival. And in the middle of this world, a man named Muhammad from the city of Mecca starts preaching something that cuts right through all of that chaos. He brings a message of unity, of worshiping one God, of leaving behind tribal feuds, and of being accountable to something higher than just your clan's honor. At first, people resisted, of course they did. Mecca was a city built around trade and pilgrimage, especially the Kaaba, which housed idols from all over Arabia. The leaders of Mecca saw this new message as a threat not just to their religion, but to their economic system. But Muhammad's message wasn't just about faith. It was about justice, charity, and dignity for the poor and oppressed. That's what made it spread. It wasn't some abstract philosophy only for scholars, it was practical. It told people how to live, how to treat their neighbors, and how to find meaning in the middle of a brutal desert life. And here's the thing. Once Islam gained traction, it created a sense of belonging that transcended tribe and bloodline. That was revolutionary. If you accepted the message, you were part of the Ummah, this global community of believers. You weren't just some outsider or an enemy because you were born into a different clan. That unity, man, that's what gave Islam its power. Now, when Muhammad and his followers were persecuted in Mecca, they migrated to Medina in what's called the Hijra. That's really the starting point of the Islamic calendar, and it's not just a date. It's the moment Islam went from being an idea to being a society. In Medina, Islam wasn't just preached, it was lived. Rules were established, disputes were settled through this new system of justice, and people began to see how the faith could organize an entire community. Medina became a blueprint for an Islamic state, where governance, law, and spirituality were all tied together. From there, Islam spread rapidly across Arabia, and after Muhammad's death in 632, you'd think maybe the movement would collapse without its leader. But that's the crazy part. It didn't. Instead, it exploded. Under the leadership of the early caliphs, Islam moved beyond Arabia into massive empires like the Byzantine and Persian. And it wasn't just because of military conquest, though battles were definitely part of it. The Persians and Byzantines were exhausted from years of fighting each other. And here comes this united, motivated force with a clear vision and purpose. But here's the nuance. When Muslims took over new lands, they didn't force people to convert. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. What they did was set up a system where non-Muslims could live under Islamic rule, keep their faith, but pay a tax called jizya in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. For many people, that was actually a better deal than what they had before under oppressive empires that squeezed them dry with taxes. So conversion often came later, not because people were forced, but because they saw benefits in adopting the new faith. And there's something else that made Islam attractive. It had this balance. On one hand, it called people to worship God, to pray, to fast, to give charity, to take care of the needy. On the other hand, it gave them a legal framework for business, marriage, inheritance, and daily life. It wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. It gave people a system they could actually build their lives around. Think about North Africa, for example. When Islam reached Egypt and beyond, it wasn't just armies storming through villages. It was merchants, scholars, and communities setting up mosques, schools, and trade networks. Islam spread through the Sahara not just on the edge of a sword, but on the back of camels loaded with goods and ideas. Over time, it blended with local cultures, creating unique Islamic traditions that were still unified by the core principles of the faith. And the same thing happened when Islam reached Persia, Central Asia, and eventually India. It wasn't uniform. The way Islam looked in Baghdad was different from the way it looked in Cairo or in Andalusia. But the shared language of the Quran, the ritual of prayer, and the sense of unity tied it all together. You had diversity within unity, which is one of the reasons Islam didn't fracture like so many other systems. So, by the 8th century, you've got this massive Islamic world stretching from Spain all the way to the borders of China. That's insane when you think about how fast it happened. And at the center of it all was this combination of faith, community, and practicality. People weren't just being handed a new religion, they were being handed a new way of life that gave them stability and meaning in a world that had been chaotic and uncertain. But the story doesn't end there, because once Islam spread geographically, the next phase was about ideas, knowledge, and influence. The Islamic world became this insane hub of learning and culture that would go on to shape the modern world in ways people don't even realize today. And that's where things get really interesting. Once Islam had expanded across this massive stretch of land, something incredible happened. The religion didn't just stay focused on battles or politics. It became this engine of knowledge, culture, and science that pulled the world into what you could almost call a golden age. And here's the thing most people don't realize. This wasn't just a Muslim golden age. This was a human golden age. Knowledge from different civilizations, Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, was preserved, translated, and built upon in the Islamic world, and then eventually handed back to Europe centuries later. Without that, the Renaissance might not have even happened. Let's break it down. When Muslims established cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and later Cordoba in Spain, they weren't just building political capitals. These were cultural and intellectual supercenters. The caliphs, especially during the Abbasid dynasty, poured resources into creating institutions like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Imagine this giant research center where scholars from all backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Persians, Indians, sat together translating texts, experimenting, and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. It's like the ultimate think tank, but happening over 1,000 years ago. What made this possible was the Islamic world view itself. The Quran encouraged reflection, observation, and seeking knowledge. So science wasn't seen as something separate from faith. It was an extension of it. Studying the stars, understanding medicine, or experimenting with mathematics wasn't about undermining God. It was about appreciating the complexity of His creation. That mindset fueled an explosion of discovery. Think about math. The concept of algebra, algorithms, even the very word algebra, comes from the Arabic al-jabr. Muslim scholars took what they inherited from Greek and Indian mathematics and developed it further, making it practical for trade, astronomy, and architecture. Then there's medicine. Guys like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote encyclopedias on medicine that were used in European universities for centuries. Hospitals in the Islamic world were already operating with systematic treatments, pharmacies, and even medical ethics, at a time when Europe was still struggling with medieval superstition. Astronomy was another big one. Observatories were built, detailed maps of the stars were created, and scholars refined the astrolabe, which sailors would later use for navigation. This wasn't just theory, it had practical applications. Muslims needed accurate calendars for prayer and fasting, precise directions to face Mecca, and navigation for their massive trading networks. And then there's philosophy and literature. Thinkers like Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd, and Ali wrestled with the big questions of existence, knowledge, and ethics, blending Islamic theology with Greek philosophy. Meanwhile, poets like Rumi and Hafiz wrote works that are still read around the world today, exploring themes of love, spirituality, and the human soul. But here's the kicker. All of this knowledge didn't stay locked inside the Islamic world. It spread outward. When Muslims ruled parts of Spain, known as Al-Andalus, they created cities like Cordoba, Granada, and Seville that were light, years ahead of the rest of Europe. Imagine walking into Cordoba in the 10th century, streetlights, public libraries, running water, while most of Europe was still dealing with mud roads and illiteracy. European scholars came there to study, translating Arabic works into Latin, which eventually sparked movements of thought that transformed Europe. And it wasn't just Europe. Through trade routes stretching across Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and into India and Southeast Asia, Islam carried not just religion but knowledge and culture. In West Africa, cities like Timbuktu became legendary centers of learning, where thousands of manuscripts on science, law, and philosophy were stored. In India, Islamic scholars interacted with Hindu and Buddhist traditions, blending ideas that would influence everything from mathematics to architecture. What's even more fascinating is how Islam spread peacefully during this phase. Sure, the armies had already established territories, but from that point forward, it was often merchants, travelers, and scholars who carried the message. Look at Southeast Asia. Islam spread there largely through trade networks. Muslim merchants came with their goods, but also their way of life, their prayers, their ethics in business. Over time, local rulers and communities saw the benefits of adopting not just the trade networks, but also the faith. That's why today, the largest Muslim country in the world isn't in the Middle East, it's Indonesia. Now, the reason this golden age mattered so much is because it kept human knowledge alive at a time when much of Europe had fallen into the so-called Dark Ages. Without Islam's role as a bridge, so much of Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian medicine might have been lost forever. Instead, it was preserved, expanded, and handed forward, and when Europe finally woke up to it, the ripple effect changed the entire course of history. But like everything in human history, golden ages don't last forever. Over time, internal divisions, political rivalries, and invasions started to weaken the Islamic world. The Mongol invasions in the 13th century were brutal, with cities like Baghdad being destroyed. Crusades from Europe also chipped away at territories. And as colonial powers from Europe eventually rose, they shifted the balance of global influence. Yet despite all of that, the foundation that Islam laid, the knowledge, the culture, the institutions, the sense of unity, never fully disappeared. It continued to influence societies even as political power shifted. And that leads us to the modern era, where Islam isn't just some historical story, but a living, breathing force shaping billions of lives across the globe. The way it spread, adapted, and continues to evolve is something we still see today. And that's where the final chapter of this story comes in. How Islam's influence persists in the modern world, and why its spread is still one of the most important human stories ever told. So now we're in the modern era, and here's where the story of Islam's spread takes on a whole new dimension. Because we're not just talking about armies, conquests, or golden ages anymore. We're talking about a religion that, despite all the ups and downs of history, has not only survived but grown into one of the largest faiths on the planet. Today, Islam has nearly 2 billion followers. That's one out of every 4 people on Earth. And what's crazy is how it continues to spread not by force, not by politics, but through migration, globalization, and the sheer power of its message. Think about it. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Muslims started moving all over the world. Wars, colonization, opportunities for trade, and later, modern migration, these waves of movement carried Islam into places where it had never been dominant before. Muslims settled in Europe, North America, Australia, and across every corner of the globe. And they didn't just bring their language or food. They brought their faith, their rituals, and their sense of community. Slowly but surely, Islam became not just something tied to the Middle East or Asia, but a global identity. What makes this even more fascinating is the way Islam resonates in modern society. A lot of people in the West, when they hear Islam, they think of politics or extremism or news headlines that focus only on conflict. But if you look past the surface, what you actually see is that Islam is offering people something they're missing in their lives today: structure, clarity, and meaning. In a world that feels chaotic, materialistic, and disconnected, Islam gives a framework that tells you who you are, how you should live, and what your purpose is. And that's attractive not just to people born into Muslim families, but to converts who are searching for answers. And the numbers show it. Every year, Islam continues to grow in countries where it wasn't historically strong. You see mosques popping up in major Western cities. You see Muslims playing major roles in sports, politics, and culture. And the faith keeps spreading, not because of political power, but because of its personal appeal. People look at the discipline of prayer, the focus on community, the emphasis on charity and family, and they say, yeah, this makes sense. Another thing is the globalization of culture. The internet, for example, has made Islamic knowledge accessible like never before. A person in Brazil, Japan, or Canada can hear the Quran recited online, learn from scholars halfway across the world, or connect with Muslim communities digitally. That kind of reach has never existed in human history. It's like the modern version of those old trade routes, except now ideas travel at the speed of light. And here's something deeper. Islam also survives and grows because it adapts without losing its core. Whether it's in Indonesia, Nigeria, France, or the United States, you'll see Muslims practicing their faith in different cultural contexts, but the foundation, the prayer, the fasting, the belief in one God, remains the same. That ability to blend with local culture while keeping a strong identity is why Islam hasn't fractured or faded away like so many other movements. But the modern spread of Islam isn't just about growth in numbers. It's also about influence. Think about how Islamic art, architecture, and even everyday practices shape societies. The call to prayer echoing in massive cities, the sight of fasting during Ramadan observed by millions around the world, or the way Islamic finance has built alternatives to conventional banking systems, all of this shows how Islam continues to shape the modern landscape. Of course, there are challenges too. Islam is often misunderstood, especially in the West. where media narratives sometimes frame it as something foreign or threatening. But when you strip away the politics and the noise, what you see is that Islam is just another part of the human story of searching for meaning. It's about trying to live with discipline, compassion, and a sense of responsibility to something bigger than yourself. And that resonates universally, and here's the wild thing. If you zoom out and look at the big picture, Islam's spread over 400 years is almost unmatched in history. It started in this tiny desert town with one man and a small group of followers. Within decades, it had built an empire. Within centuries, it had lit up the world with knowledge. And today, it's still here, still growing, still shaping lives and societies across every continent. That's the story of Islam. It's not just about history books or ancient battles. It's about people. Ordinary people who embraced a message, carried it across oceans and deserts, and lived it out in their daily lives. That's how it spread then, and that's how it continues to spread now, not by force, but by the simple, powerful pull of an idea that gives people a sense of belonging and purpose. So, when you ask how Islam spread across the world, the answer isn't one dimensional. It spread through unity in Arabia, through conquest and governance in the early centuries, through trade and culture in Africa and Asia, through scholarship and science in its golden age, and through migration and globalization in the modern world. It spread because it filled a void in people's lives, giving them stability, identity, and meaning. And in a way, it's still spreading for those exact same reasons today. And honestly, whether you're Muslim or not, it's one of the most fascinating human stories of all time. It shows us how ideas, when they resonate deeply enough, can outlast empires, kings, wars, and centuries. Islam is proof of that.